So you'll want to take a look at that if you missed the class, if you want to go back and figure out what that all means. All right, what the heck was he talking about? So that's the other thing is this little line right here is the outline of all of the chapters in the book, so you get to see them. When I remember learning how to do some speed reading, not that I did it, but I learned how to do it, is that one of the best things to do is when you get ready to read a book is to outline the book. So the author has already organized the material by chapters and sections and letterhead. So if you first just do that, then you have an overview of what this is all about. It gives you a better understanding than if you're reading this like a novel, which of course it is not a novel, right? Matter of fact, some of the chapters have nothing to do with the chapter before it, or the chapter after it. It's going to be just about a holy life and some of the things that everybody has to deal with. So that's why I did it. So you can see, like, this is what I have the entire book done, and for myself. And I figured if I did all the work, I'll just give it to you guys so you can download it right there. If you don't want it, then you don't have to do anything with it, right? So the Imitation of Christ also this is the YouTube video if you want to listen to it. Just remember that what you own in that book is a copyright protected one. Therefore, this translation will not match exactly that translation. But I think you can figure it out, and none of it's going to hurt. None of it was wrong. It's just sometimes they use words that we don't use anymore today. So it's a little weird to say it that way. But I think you're all bright enough to figure it out, right? So this is where we are. We've already done we've already done this one. So we're opening it up, and now we're doing pages 23 to 55. If you did not finish reading, all of you online, that's okay. This is meant to grow in holiness. It's not meant for you to kind of catch up because there's no exam, so you'll get no credit. So except eternal life, that's it. That's the only credit you'll get, which is worth it all, right? So so as you read the rest of the book, read the book the rest of your life. All right? Does anybody have any questions before we move on? Because now we're going to jump right into Christ is the model. Any questions? Going once, going twice? Good. I didn't want any anyway, but I felt like I had to do that because that's what a teacher does. So the first thing that we talk about is that he says, and I'm going to say this a lot of times because it's all about what he says, and then throw in my little commentaries. We must take Christ as our model and despise the things and the shams and the disillusionment of the world that we would say is part of saying. And when you're baptized, that's exactly. Do you reject Satan? Do you reject all the lies in the world and the father of this world? Do you reject that? And do you believe in God? Very big. That's the first part that he talks about. He says that Christ is the model, and we are to train all of our thoughts and our minds to be on Christ. Now, years earlier than that, St. Jerome said, ignorance of Scripture is ignorance of Christ. You don't know Scripture, you don't know Christ. So I remember one time I was doing a presentation at the what was called catechist meeting. And so somebody was bold enough to ask me to give a presentation on the Gospel of Matthew, because it was the year of Matthew, in the bar. And so I had all these CCD, directors for faith formation. And so I said, and they all knew that the topic was on the Bible, and it was on the Gospel of Matthew. And so I said, how many of you have your Bibles? And of course, nobody did. So I was like, you came to a class on the Scriptures? So then I said, now pull out a piece of paper and a pen, and I said, now besides the gospel, besides the infancy narrative and the crucifixion, tell me your favorite story of Jesus. Write down your favorite story of Jesus. And you could see they were struggling, like, what? Favorite story of Jesus. And I said, besides now the parable of the prodigal son, because we beat that into everybody who makes their first communion, what's your favorite parable of Jesus? And you could see they didn't have any. And I'm thinking, how do you know who Christ is if you don't know the gospel? You don't know that's the primary revelation of who Christ is. And the people who say that, well, I want to be like Jesus. Well, of course you want to be like Jesus, but you have to first know who Jesus is. And he says that many people are missing the spirit of Jesus. And so they're really not moved by the gospel. And that's why I have this wonderful guy sound asleep at Mass, really bored, stiff at Mass. And of course, if you don't love Christ, you can see that what we do upstairs or in church doesn't really make any sense. There's no fire in them if you don't know anything about the person we're even talking about. If you don't even love this person, if you don't even love God. And that's why when someone says, young people would say, church is boring. You have to listen to the subtext. What they're saying is that the Eucharist means nothing to me. I don't think this is interesting. I don't like this. It doesn't attract me. That's your big problem. Not the fact that if I put more into it, you'll get more out of it. It's the fact that they don't like this. It doesn't appeal to them. And he's talking about, what he talks about is the Spirit of Christ is missing in their life. And it's that classic story about, that I've said a million times, that actor who was going to do the Lord is my shepherd, and he starts, and this man who was very active goes to, it was a Hollywood party. I'll give it really quick. And then he did Shakespeare, and everybody clapped because it was just so beautiful. And then the priest, the little old man in the corner, raised his hand and said, "Could you do the 23rd Psalm?" And he said, "I'll do it only if you do it after me." And so the actor went, "The Lord is my shepherd, there is nothing I shall want." And he went through the whole thing, and everybody's done that. They all clapped. It was beautiful. And then the old priest gets up, and he says, in a very delicate, soft voice, "The Lord is my shepherd. There's nothing else shall want." After it was all done, there was a silence. And then the actor said, "I hope you see the difference here." He said, "I knew the 23rd Psalm, but that priest knew the shepherd." And that kind of very important, different distinction, of knowing the things of God, but missing the Spirit of God. Another great little one that these stories are like part of my mind. They develop my religious life, my faith life. And there was one I heard a long time ago about an artist who was doing stained glass window. And, a young guy wanted to kind of do it. So he got all the same tools, same glass, same color. He put it all together. And then they looked at it, and he said, "How come mine's not as beautiful as yours?" And he said, "You got all the same things, but you miss the spirit at which an artist does something." And I think that is so true. And it's so true in faith. You can do all the same things, but if you miss the Spirit of Christ, you are not at all moved by the gospel. That's why you can go to communion, you can go to confession, you can do all the religious things, and yet not at all be moved by a hurting person. Not at all be moved by someone who's in need. And it's like, are you missing the Spirit of Christ? And that's what he's talking about. And of course, if you remember from the introduction, we are in a time frame where he is going to criticize in the next few moments a lot of people who are very learned but have no spirit of faith. They know all the things of the catechism. They know all the things, and that's one of the things that people keep telling us. It's like, hey, look, those people, we got to teach them at St. John's. We teach them the faith. It's like, first we have to teach them to know who Christ is. We have to introduce them to Christ because they can spout off, at 313 and Edict of Milan, the church was free now to exercise its faith in public. It was but who cares? Who cares if you don't first, have the faith behind all of that? And that's the big difference. So it's not about knowing about Jesus, but loving him first, loving God first. And, and he says, know about God. There are many people who know about God, but they're missing the love and the grace of God and the humility on what it is they know. So he says it's waste to be focused only on worldly things and not on the things that are eternal. And the only way you can do that is become detached by in the things of this world, because we believe, and this is very much like Introduction to Devout Life, that the things of this world have a hold on us. And the more we can detach ourselves from the things of this world, the freer we are to know who God is, right? And to be in a great relationship with God. So, I put a few quotes in here. He says, "Give me a plain, unpretentious farmhand, content to serve God. There is more to be made of him than should be. You can see my sometimes than of some conceited university professors who forgets that he has a soul to save because he is so busy watching the stars." Now, that's because this is part of one of the trends that are going on, where we have this high intellectual life going on during his time, and universities are filled. They're talking lots about God. He said, but of course the church is in big shambles. We're right before the Reformation, and the clergy is in a state of ruin, and and so he's trying to say, look, you can learn all those high books. You could be a brain surgeon if you want, but what about the state of your soul? And of course, it's wonderful that parents, and it's always a judgment, And I say this because I don't look at anybody in particular, because they're going to say, you were looking right at me when you said that. And I'm like, I was not. I'm going to look up in the sky. But parents will want to make sure that their kids get into great universities way before they're ever thinking about their kid's soul. And that's so true. They're much more concerned about that, and that that then they can come out as wonderful brain surgeons, but in the meantime have lost their soul in the process. So anyway, one of the things he says on taking a low view of yourself. So we begin now that you begin this growth towards humility being the key. And he says, I am this. By the way, when I wrote this, it reminded me first of right after the election or around the election. And all of that. I am so tired of reading about this and that, somewhat now even too. Being lectured about this and that. All about being lectured about all that stuff that's going on right now in the world. When all I want and all I long for is to be found in you. Obviously, God. If only they would hold their tongues, these learned folk, if only the whole of creation would be silent in your presence, and you alone speak to me. Stop dividing things into classes and families. And he's talking about, the whole educational system, dividing all of these things up. He said, it's about spending your hour in adoration before the Blessed Sacrament and listening to God there. If only we would be more silent instead of 150 stations talking at each other, or 7 news stations all screaming about everyone else. Everybody just stop talking and listen to their heart, listen to the Spirit. But that's obviously not going to happen. But wouldn't that be nice if we did? Because it says you want to take a break from learning and focus on the holiness of life, and a good conscience will help you face God. It said ultimately, God's not concerned at how much you know, but the state of obviously your soul and your conscience. Because that's ultimately what you will be judged on. So no airs of learning, and when what happens is you recognize your own ignorance. And I think that anybody who learns anything about God and grows in its relationship with God, we talk about you grow into the unknown. One of the reading books that we're going to talk that's on the list is called The Cloud of Unknowing, is that as you get closer and closer to God, the more you realize how far you are. That's just the way it always is in the spiritual life. So people who always tell me they're just so close to God and I feel really close to God, I think you're just beginning the spiritual life. Because the Cloud of Unknowing talks about going into nothingness, going into the dark abyss as you move toward the light that obviously blinds you, right? So you think that you'd be able to see more, but you actually see less, and you recognize that. And he's going to talk a lot about how much you do not know about God, how much you do not. And the Catechism says that right at the beginning. There is more we do not know about God than we do know about God. And even the things we know about God are all conditioned by our limited experience. And so even our words fall short. So that even as Thomas Aquinas would say at the end, all you talk about is just straws. It's just straw. Even what he wrote after he wrote the Summa, he had a mystical experience, and he said all is straw after he had encountered his mystical experience of God. All this learned stuff. Doesn't mean you don't do it, but you have the humility that before. And one of the things I think major theologians have difficulty with in their fight with the church and theologians, especially over the last couple of years, was who has the last word, and would you submit it to the church, and let the church decide what is right and wrong, the people of faith, the history, the tradition, as opposed to yourself. And we have people that have fought with the church over that. And so I used to say that, because you don't even need faith to do theology, because it's really just a system, but hopefully you would have faith in the end to talk about God. And so it'd say sometimes the arrogance of theologians who think they know so much about God, they would have a hard time with this text. So no heirs of learning, but I recognize how much you do not know. And never think yourself better than the next man, no matter how glaring his faults are or her faults are. You are no better than anyone else, and all frail, but I am the most of frail. I said, I recognize that, of all people here, I know myself that probably, that I am probably the most frail for myself, because I don't know anyone else's, but chances are, and if you know your frailty, then and how big it is, then you realize how much, probably, of all that are frail, I'm probably the most frail. So, does that make sense? So anyway, how truth is to be learned, the truth that there needs to be learned. So you discuss the problems that we cannot do anything about. So he talks about, one of the things I keep talking about when I hear lots of confessions, and people are they're so concerned about the things that they cannot control. You cannot control that. And so he would say to you over there, you're discussing a lot of the problems that you cannot do anything about. And when you do that, you waste your time with the things that you could do something about. One of the things that they talk about in terms of successful people in the secular world is you claim your area of influence. What can you influence? And then you begin to work there. So, I will talk to people, and they're all concerned about Pope Francis, and all concerned about the things that I'm like, I can't change that. I can't do anything about that. But you know what I can do? I can go anoint the next person that needs to be anointed. I can talk to this person who can't find God, And that's one of the things that has let's cancel that there. So this idea of he says that we discuss the problems that we have no control over, and if we spent more time, with the things we can do, we wouldn't have time left to worry about the things we have no control over and no decision, unless, of course, you get the ability to get control over those things. So he says, right here, I am so tired of reading about this or that. I read this already. So the worst enemy to your freedom is peace. Right? Of your freedom and peace of mind is the fact that you are undisciplined in your life. That if you grow in discipline in your life, what that will bring you is freedom and peace of your mind. And so good and holy people are always prepared for the temptations and the demands of the self that are the hardest struggle of all. Right? But it is the only thing that is real. So he wants you to conquer your own passions in your life that cause you to sin. That's where you should be focusing on. Stop worrying about the sins of Mary. Worry about the sins in your own soul. Everybody's always concerned about other people and imperfections behind all our achievements. So more about that, but only these people would take as much trouble to weed out their imperfections and to cultivate good qualities as they take over the learned theses they propound, which needs to put forth. We should hear less about the sins and scandals and less about lax behavior in religious houses. Of course, telling you that not only just the learned, but this is the next step where he talks about the state of the faith at that time. And if you would take as much trouble to worry about your own perfections, we wouldn't have to deal with all this lax behavior that's going on in the church, in the faith, but then also too in our house, on our own lives, everybody, you know. And after death, what does it benefit? What is the only thing that's worth anything after you die? The state of your soul and the holiness. So worldly knowledge kind of distracts us, from the knowledge of God. So the big thing is humility and to do God's will. So now he's going to have a few cautions, and I think we all know them. People are often ready to believe the worst of other people instead of the best. And when I read this, it reminded me back of my seminary day when my rector, who I learned a lot from that rector, and I still repeat a lot of the things he said when we have these rectors' conferences. And he said to all of us, because there's some bickering going on among the seminarians, he says, assume the best right away until you are sure of otherwise, when he was referring to each one of us. And then here I am reading, Introduction About Life, and he says, always be ready to believe the best, because you have the tendency to believe the worst right away, right away about others, and to hand that story on to the next person. He said, a fully formed Christian does not believe everything he hears about other people. And he realizes how weak human nature is and how bent on mischief, how untrustworthy are statements that people make of others. We're at a point where I think anyway, pretty much anything I hear on the news, I somewhat believe. I'm not sure if I should believe that, because all I have to do is turn to the next station and hear the absolute opposite, right? So I don't know what to believe anymore. But in dealing with one another, and dealing with each other, and dealing with your own family, your own children, the talking that happens, is that always start with trying to believe the best. That's the goal that you should have. That should be one of the fruits of you growing in holiness. And so you'll always believe the best first. Even when you hear a story, a gossiping story. He said, don't act in a hurry to be ready to alter your, right? Don't act in a hurry. But always be ready to alter your preconceived ideas. I was amazed that, that some people will say, that was my first impressions are always hard to bend. And he would say, well, you know what, in a good Christian life, you're always ready to change your preconceived ideas. You have first impressions of someone. So it's always be ready to, don't always be ready to accept the first stories or the rumors of another, and about someone else. And always assume the best before you, as you go to hear more about the person. It'd be nice if people were always trying to give other people the benefit of the doubt that maybe if in a different situation, they would be different. And that's what I want to hope for other people. And they said, always seek the wise person in your midst. There's another place where I think I want to make sure that I get out too, because it goes along with this and it'll come up, is that seek out, because we need to talk things out. Husbands and wives would talk things out with each other or whatever, but it's amazing how once you talk with one another, talk to everybody else as well. That you find the person that you need to deal with this, and whether it's in spiritual direction or it's your person that you confide in, the wisest person you know. And that's the only person you tell when you're having a difficult problem with another person, would be his recommendation. So seeking that person out. And then he says, always be ready to read Holy Scripture. Again, not because you're so smart, you know how smart you are about the Bible, but because you want to profit your soul. It's amazing how sometimes when we start talking about the Bible, and some people want to tell me how much they know about it. They want to tell me, well, and back in the culture, they did this, and this, and sometimes homilies will do that. I'll do that, so I do that. And in the end, if the story doesn't end profit your soul, at least Imitation of Christ would say that was a waste of time, because it's not about how smart you are, it's about how this helps you grow in holiness. So read the Bible with humility all the time, with simplicity and with faith. That's how you approach the Word of God. And then about the immoderate passions, it goes back again. He talks about detachment and being humble, a humble life, the proud and the greedy. The avaricious man knows very little peace. And that's, I think, important, because only God satisfies that infinite desire that's been planted in our heart. And so for the person who doesn't have God, nothing is ever enough for them usually. They either want more, or they're not at peace. And we say, as St. Augustine said, my soul is restless until it rests in thee, O Lord. And until your soul rests in God, even Imitation of Christ would say, nothing else can satisfy you, because it's never enough. You'll always want more. You'll always feel unsatisfied. And only God can satisfy that. Imitation of Christ. So he says this too is about false confidence. A lot of people have this confidence in their faith, or self-conceit, and this idea that you cannot depend on others to make you happy by looking at their status, which is here, looking at their status, or about who you hang around with. Some of you, I know some of you would be like, yeah, that doesn't bother me. Look, I hang around with you, right? So that's fine. I can understand that, but talking to the world, and talking, with kids, sometimes they never grow up, but certainly in the world, and I chose this one here because it looked like there were some like Hollywood party and a limousine, and it's all about who you know and about who you're connected to. And he says this kind of false confidence and self-conceit. Don't boast about anything, like the friends you have, or the riches that you have, the things you have, the physical strength you have, or the beauty you have, he says. None of that is anything that one would boast on. The only one, as St. Paul says, you boast is about God and the work of God. So you only pride yourself in your good actions. If you have any good actions, then you practice crediting, which I really, really like this. Now you imitate Christ now. So a holy person, let's say you have some good actions, if you have any. He said, but you practice always crediting your neighbor, your husband, your wife, your children, whatever, with better qualities than you have. Still stay humble, and I think that is an important thing. You can almost meet holy people like that, where they seem to always see something good in another and credit it. Even if they did it themselves, they credit someone else for it, or because it doesn't matter. Not that you're doing this in a false way, because we already talked about false humility. We're not talking about that, but that a person really tries to see better qualities in other people, and recognizes them. Because then they're at peace. The idea, because it says the proud and the envy, they have, often have resentment. They have, the proud, they have envy, resentment. They want what other people have. So then he talks about the dangers of being in close intimacy with others. And this is where he says, that do not talk to everyone, as I mentioned before. Do not talk to and waste your time being with the rich or the important people for the sake of it. As you can see, look for and always go to the humble, the simple, the pious, and the well-disciplined. These should be your friends. These are the people you search out, and godly, only having godly friends. Now, this is just like, Introduction to Devout Life. People often confront this part because they're like, well, I have all kinds of friends, and I think it's good and it's healthy to have all these different kinds of friends, but you would not find that in this book. We would find that those kinds of friends are probably tedious or difficult, but he would say, that if you want to imitate Christ, you be careful who you call around. And say, well, Christ was friends with with the prostitute. We always hear that, and the tax collectors. And I'm like, absolutely. But if you read the scriptures, he didn't say, I love hanging around with prostitutes, right? I mean, what he did was he called them out of that. He went with there, but it wasn't to sort of like visit houses of ill repute. That's not what he did, right? Because those were his friends. What he did is he called them out of that, and their lives changed, right? That's the important part of it, that we never seem to continue with the sentence when we say, look who Jesus hung around with. And I say, he hung around with them because they stayed with him after they changed their life. It's not like Mary Magdalene went back and forth to work every day, when it was hanging around with Jesus. But that's what you get oftentimes when you hear them say that, right? That's usually what they say. And it's like, he doesn't hang around with those people. He calls them out of their sinfulness. Yes? Yeah. Well, I think it's this kind. I saw that, but I think what happens is that it's this kind of young people. It's the people who waste a lot of energy and time in things that don't mean anything. And I had the word youth in there, but I skipped over it when I had my notes, because I thought, but the people who are wasteful in their time, wasteful in their things, that kind of youthfulness, it's not really considered a youthful like children. You shouldn't hang around with children or something like that, but that the not the mature in the faith. That's the way I would read it, because if you take a look, read the whole sentence. It's not, see how he connects it. So he's saying, don't waste your time, and I have it here too. Don't waste of time to be with the youth, the rich, the important people, right? How else does he say it? Right. What's without good reason? Right. So don't hang around with all of these people without a good reason to do that, because it's a lot of waste of time. And you must pick that up when you, sooner or later, of course we say it just shows our age, when you sometimes hang around with you, it's like, really? Oh my gosh, I can't take this anymore. It's too much. Because remember now, he's talking about doing godly things, hanging around with godly people who talk about God, who help you be holy, who are trying to be disciplined. Well, that doesn't usually describe the youth. When you're talking about the people who are immature, But anyway, especially if it's a waste. So that's why it's on the dangers of too close intimacy, right? Only find godly friends. And if you can find a godly friend who's a youth, chances are probably a little more mature. But this is what he says, though, which is fine. I think it's in the next paragraph. But always be kind to everyone, though. It's not like you're a snob to them, right? Because it's like, oh, these are important people. I'm so you be snobby to the snobs, and it makes you feel good, right? That's not what he's talking about. Because you would be kind and humble to everyone, even the arrogant, who think you should be, who think you are less than. You say, you're right, I am less than. It's that beautiful image of the Mother Teresa, right? When she is got a child and she goes to that baker. Everybody knows that story. She said, "Will you bring some food? Do you have a piece of bread for this hungry child?" And he spits in her, right? And she says, "Thank you. That was for me. Now, do you have anything for the child?" And that sense of, he's arrogant, and she doesn't fight back with that arrogance, or who do you think you are? You're arrogant, nothing. But continue to be kind in the face of that. That is wicked hard to do. Let me tell you, because it eats away at your pride more than ever. And that's why the big issue is obedience. I found this slide, which is really good. Obedience, the key to spiritual growth. Now, obedience is a dirty word in our culture, in our culture today, and yet obedience and submissiveness is key to the spiritual life. You freely submit yourself to your superiors. he's talking to religious life, but to superiors in our life, we all like to have it our own way. I love to have it my own way, and I couldn't wait to be pastor so I could have it my own way. And then I realized you can't have anything your own way. Anyway, but prefer to be with people who think, we love to be with people who think like us. And he says, you may be right, all right, absolutely right, and your boss is wrong, your boss is absolutely wrong, but do not worry, let the other have his way for the love of God. Now, that doesn't match my upbringing at all. And I don't know how much, if that's probably something I need to learn after I learn a couple of other things, because that one would be tough. And because of course, even when I don't like what the bishop does, I'm like, I have obedience to the bishop, and my holiness will come in obedience to the bishop, even if I think he's absolutely wrong. But then again, I want it my way, which I probably always want it my way. Anyway, he says you may be right, but do not worry. Do not worry, because if you let someone have their way for the love of God, that's the reason. Not just sure, go ahead, let's see what happens. You know what? Which of course would be my first attitude. Would be like, yeah, I'm going to stand back and watch what happens now. If you only had listened to me, because I told you so, right? But for the love of God, I'm not the one in charge. And one of the things I remembered, I had a little spiritual movement there, a little, conversion when I was in Rome, and I was walking across the piazza, and John Paul II was giving yet another announcement on the audience and people, and it was just amazing, just the number of people that would come there for the talks he would have outside. And I was going across to something, I can't remember where, but one of the dicasteries or some of the houses, and I was thinking, I have my work to do, and he has his work to do. We all have our work to do, and we're all part of building up this church, and this is what I need to do. And it made me think that, just be obedient, because you know what, I don't have that responsibility, and I don't carry that kind of responsibility that he carries. So, and that's oftentimes what I tell myself with the bishop in the end, is that, you know what, I don't have to answer for any of those things. He's the one that's to answer. So what can I do for the love of God? Is it always better to take advice than to give it? That doesn't fit well right now. Right. I love to give advice, and if you agree with others when there is a good reason, it's a sign of pride. If you agree with others when there's a good reason to agree with others, then it's a sign of pride and obstinacy. One of the things that is difficult with that is that when having an argument, sometimes, it's so hard to agree with another if you know you're losing the argument, right? Because sometimes pride, and I think that this is part of the issue with where we are in the political system, right? The whole pride and the stubbornness of, rather than trying to solve this problem, and finding the good, is long gone, right? Because that's how their culture is built on. They need to step over. They need to be the winning voice. They need to get it done. The one who gets it done, the name they make for themselves. But he said, but to agree with one another, or to try to come to an agreement, I don't know. I think that's long gone. Anyway, so it's a long list of things we all have to work on, right? Because here's the biggie, the absolute big one that is all through Introduction to Devout Life, all through the Gospels, all through here, how useless gossip is. Really. He said, keep clear, maybe I have this, keep absolute clear from the babble of human voices. Okay? And he goes on, why do we love gossip? It does no good at all. And he says, anybody who's going to imitate Christ never wastes any time on frivolous gossip of other people, and so a whole section, and it's kind of come up again and again and again because it is one of the big sins that we all have to deal with in that tongue, that there is no reason to talk about other people to other people for just the sake of talking about them. And it's interesting because he goes on some other things, but on this one is that we give good reasons why we should gossip to ourselves and to everyone else when we're gossiping. It's like, I know this is gossip, but I got to tell you, you really need to know this. So anyway, the whole point in all of this is really to attain peace in your mind. That's what God wants. And it made me even think of that myself, because I had this long discussion. I was wasting some time and had a long discussion. And we started talking about all kinds of things about the political system and all that stuff in the world. And when all was said and done, I was not at all in any better place, mentally, spiritually. That kind of stuff did not lead me anywhere there. As a matter of fact, I thought about it 100 times again after the conversation. Have you ever repeat a conversation over and over in your mind, and you should have said this, and I bet if I said this, and this was a better argument, and I'm like, what happened to the peace I had before I started engaging in that? So he says, we would be all at peace if we did not concern ourselves with what other people say and do. So wean yourself after earthly desires and cling with every fiber of your heart to God, and attend to the business of your own soul. That is the big thing in the spiritual life. Your own soul. We have not gotten rid of the passions and the desires that we have in our soul, and so we're not yet free from the things of this world. And any kind of difficulty that we experience, because we're now going to start talking about temptation. Any kind of difficulty we experience, we always return back to human consolation, things of this world to console us. And he puts in a big reminder that in religion, you can attend to all of the external observances, but you must, he says, apply the axe to the root of our nature before we will have any peace. There's stuff that is going on. It's amazing how, I don't know, we can spend our entire life going to church and being religious people, and yet still have a lot of difficulty in our attachment to the things of this world, almost like the gospel has yet really to take any effect in our life. And too often our lives are better at the beginning, like that. At the beginning of our lives. I used to say that in vocations, dealing with the seminarians. So you remember the fervor you used to have? That you're going to serve God, and you were going to bring people back to the church, and you would go to Mass every day, sometimes during your lunch hour, or you get up at 5 o'clock to get to the 6:30 a.m. Mass in your parish, and all of that stuff. And then now you're in your second year or third year of theology, and you just can't get out of bed, and Mass is right downstairs, and it's at 8 o'clock. So, what happened to all the fervor you used to have? It's so true. But then I think of people, I am really convinced that most people, especially the good like politicians, that they go in there really believing that they're going to change something. They're going to change the world. They want to serve the people. I think that's how it starts out. They have these altruistic, I think lawyers do the same thing, priests do the same thing, police do the same thing, and then things happen along the way that where you make decisions. And he says, all too often our lives were better at the beginning when we first turned to God, when we first had that conversion. He says, and now, we don't often grow more intense, but we actually grow less. We fall slowly away. We lose the fire and the steam. It's not easy, he says, when you start learning in this journey and you start going through these things, you realize that you lose a lot of the things you're accustomed to. and and the bad habits that you have to break. So why it is good for us to not have everything our own way. And I think that's what's good is because when we go through difficulty, and this is where I'm going to end because there's a number of them on this, and I want to make sure. When we go through difficulty, this is according to the Imitation of Christ now. When we go through difficulties in our own life, they often call upon us, right, to see what the stuff is that we're made of. And so humility, it helps us along the way, or it shows us. And so we go through afflictions and temptations and difficulties like that, and temptations. It says they help us to purify our faith. They help us to teach us. They become stepping stones to holiness, temptations and difficulties. He says everyone has difficulties and temptations. And no one, he says, becomes holy without being tempted. This is that beautiful thing right there. I found, used to have that little whispering in your ear, the bad angel, the good angel, whispering in your ear. Temptations are key. He says, you will never get beyond temptations, so realize they are part of your life. So grow accustomed to having temptations in your life. All right, that you'll never get beyond them. When one leaves, he says another one comes. Some run away from the temptations, and wherever they're running, they find some over there, more over there. You cannot win the battle by running away from temptations, but he said you begin to learn it. So let's bring it down to me. Okay? Everybody knows that sooner or later I'm going to deal with. I'm going to come in here and you're going to say, "What happened? You lost half your size." Right? It's going to be about food, right? So one of the things we do is this is the advice they give you. Just clean your cupboards out. Get rid of all those M&Ms. And don't let them in your house and the Reese's peanut butter cups. But I live with 4 other people, right? And they and even brother who made an apple pie the other day, which I ate some today already. Again, he said, but I'm always going to deal with that temptation. It's going to be something I'm always going to face. And I have to learn to deal with it because as soon as a bag of Oreos comes in the house, it's gone. The temptation is gone. So he said, that's why through patience and endurance and with God's grace, it will bring you greater success than that violent and frantic effort on our part to go up and down on the scale. He's like, be patient and endurance and God's grace to deal with it. So whether the idea would ultimately be, the final goal would be, there would be a Reese's here and I wouldn't even look at it. I'd be like, oh yeah, that's interesting, which has not happened yet, because I'd be like, I think I want that. It's like, anybody getting that? And then I do a couple more lines. It's still here, So I remember there was somebody. And I say this only as a way to enlighten it, not at all to say anything about this person, because like he says, look, I am frail, and everyone deals with temptations. But I had a friend of mine who had the bypass, surgery, and we all got together, and she was looking good. She was looking really good, and we were all at the table, and then after we had eaten, in came the 3 big desserts, and I was interested because I was looking, well, how is she doing? How's she doing? But I watched her look constantly at those desserts, and I also watched her take a little piece, and then take another little piece, and take another little piece. And it's like when you watch the Biggest Loser or My 600-Pound Life. I watched them all. If you ever watched them, I watch them all. Because I'm thinking, sooner or later, don't go there, please, don't go there, don't go there. But you can see that they're trying to help, but that they got the food out of them, but they They didn't let the food in them, but they didn't get the food out of them. You know what I mean? The desire didn't leave, and the things that were hooks in them never left. And so, it's like that big time of Egypt when they wanted to go back. I always say they got out of Egypt, but Egypt didn't get out of them, right? And so my attachment is they got out of me, but I didn't get out of that myself. And that what he's talking about in the end is that it's about patience and endurance. And what happens, I think what's beautiful about this is real life. He's trying to say, look, you'll always have this temptation. Don't run away from it. It's by God's grace that you face these things. And he says, like being a ship without a rudder, which I think I have that picture here. Being a ship without a rudder is a man who grows slack and lost a sense of aim. Temptation, he says, is fire to iron. Only in temptation is your true nature appears. Take care at the beginning, because if you let it in, it sets deep. And that, I was like, oh, that's so true. We deal with people that are close to me, let's say, or alcoholics. It's so deep in them, and it's so hard for them to get beyond that. And when I have a lot of respect for people who go through AA, and they're 35 days sober, they're 80 days sober, they count them because they know that the thing that alcohol is that the roots are deep. And the people who don't have these, they're often like, why didn't you just stop? And I'm like, don't you think they thought of that before? If they had thought of that, that would have worked. It's like when someone tells me, just take one Hershey kiss a day. That's all you need. And I'm like, that's why you look like the way you look, and I look like the way I look. It doesn't work. If it worked, I think I would have figured that out by now. After my 17th one, I would have known that doesn't work. That's so easy. So now when people tell me that, I'm like, oh, I never thought of that. Thanks. That is great advice. The only way that's going to work is if you lock the other 16 up. And then one drops out a day. That's the only way that's going to work. I'm telling you. And I watched this great movie. Steve Carell, the guy who played on The Office. A very serious movie. It was a serious movie about, he had a son in the movie. It's not his, but his son who had a drug addiction. If you've seen that, it was a great movie. What's the name of it? Beautiful Boy. Oh my gosh, your heart just wrenched because he's doing so good. He's helping people. He's even talking about it to the younger people to stay off of drugs. Meets another person, starts to lie, starts to cheat, falls back into it. And it's the cycle that happens, until I remember a man coming to see me where he had a little boy, and his wife was in another state, and she overdosed and she died. And I know that because they were good people. It started with, back pain pills that got out of whack, that got inside there. And it's like, it is that these are good people. These are very good people. And it's a pain. And that's why he said, it's at the beginning. At the beginning. That's when these temptations, he said, when you get the little ones, you fight those little ones right there. You don't let them into you. Because when they get in, they set themselves so deep within you that you will not be able to overcome them. I often say things like, look, these things are so big that people lose families and whole careers. They lose everything. And then nations, they lose their kings, have lost kingdoms over these kinds of addictions. That are real. And that's why they're not to be played around with, but they're part of the spiritual life. So he says, take care at the beginning, because once you let it in, it sets in deep. So he gives this 7 step. He says, first, the thought confronts the mind. The imagination paints it in stronger colors. Like, that'll be very good. Just no problem, And then we take pleasure in it. Then the will makes a false move and you give your assent. And then it gradually infiltrate. It's gradual and it's infiltrating. And then you wonder, how did I get here? All because we put, oops, you can see I typed this up. We put up no resistance at the start. The longer our sluggish reactions, the more feeble our resistance grows day by day, and the enemy is more and more powerful in our life. It says and one of the things I like about this book is very clear. This experience differs for different people. That everybody has a different one, and sometimes it's really amazing, especially when people are going through struggles of temptation in their life, and the other people don't have it, but they can't make the connection that they have other struggles. That temptation is difficult, but temptation is the same among. But there are socially acceptable temptations and not socially acceptable temptations, and ones that are looked down upon, and then ones that are like, oh yeah, that's no problem. However, when you take a look at the root of it, it's all the same. It's all the same. It's what drives you. It's okay. It's really okay to be greedy, much, much more greedy, than to have an addiction, even though your greed is driving you just as much as this addiction is driving them. But it's okay to be that way, because it's acceptable. But he says, and don't despair when you're being tempted. It means you must turn to God and more and be stronger in prayer. That's this picture. So don't despair. He says, make spiritual advances, go through, because going through hard times, not easy times, you make great spiritual advancements there. And I think this is hard for us because we don't make spiritual advances when we're sluggish and lazy and fat and happy and everything is going well. It is amazing how through struggle and difficulty you make great spiritual advances, because it's there that you're tested. And my favorite line is by, it's either John F. Kennedy or Bob Kennedy, I can't remember, but anyway, it's like one of the Kennedys. I could go back and look at it. It is only in the depths of winter that you find which trees are still green. And I think that image to me, it reminds me, it's only when you'll find the biggest temptations and the biggest struggles that you find where, what is still alive in you, where you can grow spiritually. And he says, that's why in imitation of Christ, your temptations and your struggles and your failings, he says, these are good for you. They're good for you. You're like, well, in a world in our world of perfection in Hollywood, you have to, it's very different. He says, some stay away from grave temptations, but fall from the petty day-to-day ones. So look, listen, I never had an affair in my marriage. So, yeah, but the small day-to-day temptations you give in all the time to, and so you sort of pride yourself in staying away from the big ones, but you still deal with the hooks of the day-to-day ones, the day faults that should hopefully keep you as humble and always in need of God's grace, because I can always fall. I can fall tomorrow, and that idea of by God's grace do I walk all the time. There's a serious spiritual disposition because it keeps you humble and it recognizes that each one of us has our crosses to bear, our struggles to deal with, and if we stop talking about one another and helped each other and dealt with our own stuff, and one of the things I do tell all this time, I was like, look, one of the reasons why you're so concerned about so many other people's sin is because you have yet to deal with your own. Because when you start trying to change your life and you know how hard it is, then you're usually much more forgiving to other people who struggle to change their life, right? But it's usually that if people who know their own sins and have wept over their own sins are usually much more forgiving of other people's sins. And it's usually the one who seems to have no need of confession that tend to kind of be the most critical of other people's sins, when really it's the other way around. And I am convinced of it because you can see kind of that holiness. So that's why you avoid hasty evaluations of other people. He says, always be slow to criticize. Be your own critic. And a personal preference can rob you of your power to see. So that, and what he's meaning by that is like, be your own critic. And he said, when you prefer other people and stuff like this, you often blinds you from the power to see straight. And also being stubborn. You're being stubborn within your own opinions. It blinds you from seeing the truth. And so it's like, oh, he's really stubborn. That's not a trait you should be bragging about, that you're stubborn, because it means that you will choose that over the truth that you want to belong to. All right? So we only got to, I'll finish this one here. This one, I like, John Bosco has this quote, famous quote all over the place. It's all over the web. Put up willingly with the faults of others if you wish others to put up with yours. I think that's where I'll end, because it's time, is that oftentimes people expect others to put up with their faults more than they are willing to put up with the faults of others, and maybe even minimize our own faults. And so sometimes with husbands and wives, so irritating about some of their faults, and I'd say, well, you know what? That's your place of holiness, in the way you can put up with anyone else's faults, with the understanding, of course, it's supposed to be mutual, that you know your own faults that they have to put up with because of you. And that's so important in terms of charity. And I had this one here was, into self-seeking and into, okay. So that's why in criticizing and putting up the faults with others, I had that one because that was say no love can justify doing wrong. Yeah, all right. Now that's in the next section. So we'll pick up with that one, because there's a whole section on that where everyone has faults and you have to put up with them till God makes it different. And I think, this is the one I want to make sure of. I'm going to repeat this again. So imitation of Christ. It's very clear. I put it in mind. Stop nagging each other. And he says everyone has faults and you have to put up with them until God makes it different. God made the faults in every one of us as well. He allows them to happen. God uses the faults to test your virtue, to test your patience, and your charity. And so when somebody has a fault, or husband, wife, children, parents, whatever, they have a fault that just irritates you, and it just shows, maybe they do have the fault, but it also shows how impatient you are, how not virtuous you are, how critical you are. And his idea is just stop nagging. And it's what's interesting is I tried to find a picture of a man nagging, and I could not find one. They're all women nagging children, nagging their husband. But I did try to look for one. I was gonna color the hair and make one guy have longer hair and cut off the hair of the other one, because it was all the pictures. But it doesn't matter, because you know what? We don't go that far, because we know that the spiritual life is for everyone, right? So stop nagging. He says, we want everyone around us to be perfect, except us. I love that line. Others need to be spoken to and corrected, but we hate it when we are called on the carpet. So when are you going to talk to him about this? Well, after I talk to you about your stuff, right? Rules are usually for everyone else. I always think of this all the time when I'm driving. If it's yellow and I race through that yellow light and I get it just in time, I'm usually like, yeah, good. If I'm sitting there at a red light and I watch someone run through a yellow light, how dare you run through that? Do you know how dangerous that is to run through that yellow light? Or even worse, even worse, construction sites. So there are 2 lanes, and you know they're merging in. And so you're in the lane that hasn't merged yet, and so you get all the way up, and then you sneak in. And you're like, phew, I got in front of all those cars. But you're sitting back there in a car, and you see a car get down there, and it's like, hey, get back there, you know. I snuck in this far, you can sneak in behind me, not in front of me, right? Right. So anyway, everyone wants rules everyone wants everybody to follow the rules except us. And he says God does not want everyone to be perfect, which is interesting. And of course, he's not talking about the life of perfection. That's a different phrase. But the idea of that the imperfections is a part of my life, he has dealt with that. He's had means and ways of dealing with that. And it's through charity and virtuous growth. That's the way he has given us to deal with these things and not to wipe them all clean. All right, so we'll end there. I'm on 16. I want to pick that one back up because it's really a good thing. But so we'll just start at 16. As you know, I'm always a little behind, but we'll end up on the same time because some of the stuff kind of repeats itself again. But I would say just continue reading it, and we'll do 16 again next week. All right? So we do a little glory be. Get you guys home at 7:39. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So remember, it's not just about learning this stuff. Because he's already criticized you if all you can do is repeat it back. You have to live it. And you're not going to do it right, so decide that now. Good night, everybody online. We'll see you. Take care.